Greetings and welcome to the last mini lecture on the House of Commons. I want to resume in your notes with some areas in which the US Congress and the British House of Commons share some characteristics, but there is more of an emphasis in one political system than the other. And let me go through the list and you can follow along in your notes. There are five of them that I listed. Obviously, there are more tasks than this, but these are the five that stand out to me. The first and the most important one in the British system is the training and recruitment of political leaders. Certainly, you could make the argument that in the United States there are people who have served in the Senate or the House and have gone on to be presidents or vice presidents. And I talked about that earlier. But keep in mind that in the British system, there is one roadmap to the top, and that is through the House of Commons. You serve, first of all, in the House of Commons. You have a lengthy apprenticeship in which you're probably going to be a cabinet secretary, maybe of many. I'll talk later in the next module when I talk about prime ministers. I'll give you Theresa May's uh, kind of resume and the fact that she headed so many different departments before she eventually became prime minister, I think will surprise you. I do believe that this lengthy apprenticeship, which has gotten a bit shorter in recent years, I talked about Winston Churchill. It took him 38 years in the House of Commons before he became prime minister. It took Margaret Thatcher 20 years. Uh, People like Tony Blair, it's been closer to 15 years. It's varied a bit. Gordon Brown, I think, was 25 years. But I think that this lengthy apprenticeship, it builds party loyalty, it builds party cohesion, and it certainly gives the prime minister a certain amount of legitimacy. The fact that they've gone through this labyrinth, that they've had to serve in multiple roles and prove themselves to the party in order to rise to the top. So certainly, I think the training and recruitment of political leaders, this is far more important in the British system than in the American system. Now, the second one, I think it's the opposite, representing constituents. Less important than in the United States. Certainly, uh, Britain is divided into 650 constituencies, and members of parliament do represent constituents in their district. They do link citizens to the state. But in the United States, this link between constituent and representative is far stronger. Certainly, if you take a look at our Congress people, I talked earlier about how constituency service is at the heart, especially in the House of Representatives, to getting reelected because they only have a short two-year term and they're almost in constant reelection mode. And I do think that we perceive of our congressperson as representing us more personally, whereas in Britain that linkage is more through party loyalty. So it is a bit different. The third, informing the public through floor debate and question time. There is a weekly question time in Britain. It's highly entertaining. It's highly watched. Certainly, you can take a look at floor debate. I don't know if any of you have gone on C-SPAN and watched Congress, but it's not particularly exciting stuff. I actually think the most excitement on a regular basis is actually looking at some of the more important committees in Congress, and certainly that congressional work is lacking in the British case. Scrutinizing and refining legislation, I think that this occurs in the House of Commons, but I think that the scrutiny of legislation is far greater in the United States. The U.S. Congress is better equipped through the committee system to actually line by line analyze legislation, get expert testimony, etc. And that does not occur in Britain. And of course, the fifth task of Parliament is very, very different than in the United States. The fact that they can actually compel the resignation of the government through a no confidence vote. And I already explained that this is very different than an impeachment. For the resignation of a British prime minister, you don't need a criteria. You can just say, we're tired of this person. In the United States, you have to make the case that the president is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. And while there is some ambiguity about exactly what that means, it certainly is a far higher bar than in Britain. I listed three major functions. I think you could argue that all three of these exist in both political systems. Both in Britain and the United States, the legislature scrutinizes and passes laws. They both provide finances for the state by authorizing taxation. In fact, the U.S. Constitution specifically says that money bills, tax bills, have to begin in the House of Representatives. In both the U.S. Congress and in the British House of Commons, they review, they scrutinize public policy in budgetary allocations, which most people would simply call spending. I then turned to the speaker, and I made kind of a big deal out of this because this is a huge difference. In the United States, the Speaker of the House is the most powerful figure in Congress, and the Speaker of the House is the only congressional figure that is specifically mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. The Speaker of the House is third in line to the presidency. The Speaker of the House is the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives, and the Speaker of the House has far more power than their Senate counterpart, the Senate Majority Leader. In the British system, the Speaker is a completely different figure. Unlike the United States, the Speaker of the House of Commons is neutral. The Speaker can only vote if there is a tie. And in the entire history of Great Britain, this has only happened 49 times. And the last time that the Speaker actually voted on a piece of legislation in Great Britain was 30 years ago in 1990. As I pointed out in the notes, the major role of the Speaker is to maintain order and impartiality, to give both sides ample and relatively equal time to speak. And if you have ever listened to Question Time, you are going to be unable to tell if the speaker has a preference for one party or another, because their role is to be nonpartisan. Their role is to be neutral. They are there essentially to umpire the political circus that is the British House of Commons. Unlike the United States, where the Speaker of the House takes a very active political role, the Speaker of the House is the person who is guiding whether legislation moves forward or not through the Rules Committee, and I mentioned that in earlier lectures. The sixth point that I raised in the notes is that the British House of Commons is a reactive legislature. In Great Britain, the vast majority of legislation that is introduced into the House of Commons is introduced by the government. Most legislation is passed intact, without amendments or with very minor amendments because of the strict party discipline that exists in the British parliamentary system. I told you earlier that nearly 97% of government-sponsored legislation introduced in the House of Commons has been approved. And certainly that is a reactive legislature. The legislature is reacting to the legislation that is being introduced by the executive branch. Once again, there is legislation that is sponsored by the executive branch in the American political system. If both houses of Congress are dominated by the president's party, they often tend to be deferential, but not to the same extent as in Britain. And certainly, Congress is much more likely to scrutinize, add amendments, refine it, change it, and certainly in a case like in recent years, uh, the norm in American politics has been divided government, with part of the government being controlled by the Democrats, part of the government being controlled by the Republicans, and the result is usually gridlock, and it takes extraordinary measures to even get simple things passed. Obviously, the people who like the British system, and I'm one of them, you don't get gridlock because one political party is the majority party, obviously, in both the legislature and in the executive branch. And that majority party can implement their program very, very efficiently and can get things done. Now, the criticism of that might be that it's equally easy to pass both good and bad legislation in Britain, and that would be a valid criticism. The contrary position is it is equally easy to kill both good and bad legislation in the United States. So the United States is a much more conservative system. It is a much more status quo oriented system. It's a much more static system. The British system is more dynamic and it is easier to enact meaningful public policy change. The last major point that I made in the notes is that unlike the United States, where I believe that the committee structure makes the United States the most powerful and independent national legislature in the world, in Great Britain, committees are not specialized. Committees do not act as a filter to legislation like they are in the United States. In Great Britain, the committees that do exist, they don't call witnesses, they don't gather data, and so this is true in a lot of European countries. France is another country where the committees are very large, they're very unspecialized. They don't. They're not well funded. They're not well staffed. They don't have a lot of experts that they can rely on, like the American Congress. And so, the closest thing in Europe to the American committee structure system is the German Bundestag, their legislature, which really functions like a law factory. Uh, they really do churn out legislation and they do have very specialized committees. Germany is also one of the rare European countries that have a meaningful upper house, the Bundesrat, which, like the American states did at one time, really represents the interests of the states. And you may remember me earlier saying that in Germany, the states have a lot more power, and the fact that the upper house is directly responsive to them, and that state legislatures in Germany select these people, really creates a much more meaningful and dynamic upper house. But that is rare in Europe. I concluded with a comment saying that the ascendancy of the government, the executive branch, over the House of Commons is largely due to the presence of party government in Britain. This ensures that the government can count on its loyal supporters in the Commons to support their programs, which they do on a regular basis. Now, this is the end of this module. This is the end of this test material. I would urge you to just know the only thing I will ask you about Costa Rica and the Ukraine that is mentioned in your chapter is to know what kind of political system that it has. In other words, is it presidential or is it parliamentary? Is it unitary or is it federal? Just basically know what the political makeup of those two systems are, and you'll get the question or two that I'm going to ask you on that. Otherwise, all the other questions are going to be the U.S. Congress and the British House of Commons. After the exam, we move to executives, and we'll deal with that in the next module.